So without any further ado, boys, it is now time to answer this question. How has AI affected tech hiring? I think I'm going to start with you, Ian. How has it affected tech hiring?
Well, I suppose there's one big change for us in tech hiring. So we used to have a take-home test. In fact, when I joined here, Jamie, we had a take-home test 6 years ago.
That's right. I famously
and it was
offered you half the salary for double the work, and you accepted.
Yes. I'm still waiting for half the salary. I never liked take-home tests anyway, because I think they're unfair. Basically, it's quite cheeky, I think, to ask people to do basically, a few days. Well, it depends how much time you spend on them, but potentially people will spend days on these things trying to get them right. And to me, it seems like free labor. If you can't work out in an hour whether someone's capable or not, you should probably rethink things. So, but obviously with the advent of AI, it became more difficult to evaluate whether someone was capable based on these take-home tests, because you could get the AI to write it and then introduce a few spelling mistakes and make it look like you'd done it. So that was an opportunity for us to get rid of the take-home test, and we replaced it with a pairing interview, an hour-long pairing interview, where a fairly simple task is given to someone, but it's a fairly typical task for a software engineer to do. And it was really to see, well, first of all, to show that you could actually get your hands on a keyboard and write something, right? And the question then arose: what do we let people do? Do we demand that they write from memory, without being able to Google anything even, or do we go to the other extreme and let them use whatever tools they like, including AI? And I was pretty insistent that we should let people do whatever they do in their normal job, because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for someone who can be effective in the job. So that's one big way it's changed things.
Your implication, though, Ian, is that they couldn't be effective in their job just relying on generative AI. They would have to know how to interact with the AI, how to interpret the results. So I'm guessing your implication is that AI cannot presently do the job of a programmer, at least the type of programmer or engineer we want here at Container Solutions.
Well, exactly. So it's not whether they can use AI to write code for them. Anyone can do that. It's what they do with that code that's generated, if they choose to generate code with AI. And you can tell very quickly when you work with someone how critically they're evaluating what they see, how they then use that, what they're thinking about. We ask during the pairing that they tell us their thought process. And if it's clear that they're capable at doing something, then we just say, okay, we assume you can do that. Now, what would you do next, and how would you use this, and what kind of tests would you want to write, and how would you do that?
I chatted to a business recently that had 100 engineers, and that successfully began to roll out generative AI tools for programming and cloud engineering and the type of work that we do. And about 15 of the 100 engineers absolutely excelled, and about 85 stalled out. They couldn't use the tool. They struggled. And the manager there came to the conclusion that those 15 engineers were the best 15. They were already very, very good, and they were probably carrying the other 85. And actually, what the AI had done is shine a spotlight on the most talented people within the organization, and at the same time, shone a spotlight on the rather less talented. And I think the conclusion they came to was that, well, actually, what you've got now is a multiplier. So somebody with the tool will really know how to use it. It will really amplify their skills. Do you agree with that? Do you agree with that assessment, or have you seen anything similar to that?
I think actually Angus has an interesting opinion worth hearing on this.
You're a bella. Cut that out.
You can't call him that. No, we're not calling it out. That's my name for him. Right, okay. Tell us, Angus. Tell us all about it.
Okay. AI is a tool. And I think if you are, as you said, they did what they couldn't use it and stormed out. Obviously, that's not a good response. But there's levels to being able to use the tool and whether you should even use the tool at all. So I think AI is very useful to help you write code, to help you diagnose issues, figure out where bugs came from, root causes, follow stack traces, and to help you code in languages you're not familiar with, stuff you've never done before. When you've been doing something for a long time, when you're very good at it, and you know the nuances of it, I think AI can only really accelerate you if you trust the output it's giving you, which I think a lot of engineers who are opposed to using AI in their day-to-day or vibe coding or whatnot, that's likely their stance, is that they don't trust what it's giving you, because verifying does take time. As much as we'd like to say, oh yeah, we just set the agents running and they'll just split out all the code. But you need to read it. And one day we might, people made the point, oh, well, we don't read what the compiler outputs, which is very true. But then you come to the point of, well, compilers are deterministic. A person wrote what the compiler is actually doing. So you trust in their expertise and their, battle scars to tell you that the compiler is producing good stuff. We don't have that with AI yet. We don't have that with LLMs yet.
Well, indeed, it's not deterministic, isn't it? I remember when I first started programming, people would say it's the compiler, and I used to say it's not the compiler. It's not the compiler. Software does eventually work. How do you think that's changed how tech hiring works, Angus?
I think hiring managers, especially in smaller companies, often don't understand the signals they're looking for. So they'll say, no AI, no Googling and whatnot, because they want to see, raw expertise. But then, as Ian's mentioned, you're missing what would they actually do in their day-to-day job? Because at work, I don't just code from memory, never Google anything, never talk to AI ever. I do the things I need to do the job the best. So if I don't understand something, I'll look it up, I'll read some docs. If I don't have time to sit and wade through loads and loads of logs, I might ask AI to point out the right part for it, and I'll verify that's what it's told me is valid, and then go from there.
Yeah, exactly. You need your tools for your job, right? I do remember when I was a young man, Ian mentioned Java earlier, so I didn't start this. On my desk, I had design patterns, Martin Fowler's refactoring. I think he had a big book, because we used to, this is how old I am. This is pre, sensible websites about programming. And I think I had the Java foundation classes there. So I would, look up what I was trying to build and the APIs. If the Java docs, for example, were unavailable. And I got pulled aside by a manager who said that my behavior was not instilling confidence in my colleagues. And that the fact that I relied on so many books was a sign that I was a bad computer programmer. And of course, I basically told this person to fuck off, and then explained that you don't understand anything about how computer programming works. This is my process. I explained it. So I guess those books would be the equivalent of ChatGPT nowadays. And I think you hit it on the head, Angus. This is not a test of memory. This is a test about skills and workload, how you use your tools to get to the result you need.
I think what Angus said is true, is that many hiring managers look for signals without understanding what those signals mean. So I think if you ask someone, what the first 4 Linux system calls, on one level, that's a ridiculous memory question, right? On the other hand, if you're immersed in the Linux kernel, you'll just know them. So it is a signal that someone has steeped in that world. But if you're asking someone, if you're at work and you need to know what the first 4 Linux syscalls are, well, looking them up is a perfectly good answer. And, we're not hiring people who've devoted their lives to the kernel. We're hiring generalists who can find themselves in any situation where they're asked to produce something, perhaps in a language they don't know. And can they sit down and start working towards that goal in a constructive way? That's what we're hiring for as consultants. So asking those kind of questions would be completely pointless. So it's not like we're against the idea of asking people those kind of questions, but you have to understand what the signal is telling you. And it does that conform to what you're looking for in the job. So I could understand it if some tech hirers say, no, we need people who understand the Linux kernel inside out, and that's our stars for 10. But I think for the vast majority of jobs in software are about delivering something to a certain specification.
Let me now bring Gus into this, because I'm going to do some pretty severe shithousery right now, and I'm going to quote somebody from LinkedIn. So somebody on LinkedIn, a man called Slava, and this was shared on our internal tech channels. He basically says on LinkedIn, stop calling yourself a software engineer if you can't pass a technical interview without a coding agent. We are rapidly entering to an era of, quote, cargo cult engineering, unquote, where candidates ship sloppy, unvetted code they didn't actually understand. Now, this person seems angry or passionate, depending on your perspective.
So I'll start answering this question by telling a story of my own. My company that I created recently and unfortunately shut it down. I was responsible for hiring engineers. One of the best engineers that I could hire was actually a designer. And he was able, via mastering a tool, which was an LLM and IDE that supported LLM, he was able to master front-end code with perfection, with good design, just by interacting over the configuration of that tool itself. He was such a great front-end engineer that actually I needed no one else to do that. He would get a wireframe that I would draw with him. He would get that wireframe, create a very pretty design with sensible user experience flow. Then he would code it from scratch up to finish line, just mocking endpoints. And then we will have someone, typically me, create the backend endpoints for that, make it work. If any hiring processes takes away the tooling that people are going to use, we are effectively missing out on candidates. It is already a filter. Whatever hiring decision we take on how the process looks like, we are anticipating a decision. We are applying a filter. Now, is this a conscious decision? Even though I made that argument, I'm going to tell you another story. Very common to see whenever we are doing this hiring, same company, same job role, the engineer used the tool, the LLM, to script out their entire actions within the interview itself. That type of behavior of using that tool was actually a red flag because the engineer itself was not authentic. Whenever we forced him to think on the spot, he couldn't. He needed to stop, think, block. So it's really how one uses the tool. It's something that we should always evaluate, right? And it's not even a new topic. AI is just a new tool. But if we go back to, 200, 300 years ago, where everyone needed to craft manually a pottery piece, yeah, every hiring manager on that job would basically look for the best handcraft material. Then industry came up. How that hiring period on that technology change really happened. Eventually, now we still have craftsmen, but for an industry perspective, we hire someone that is able to use the machine that creates the pottery, that is able to maintain the machine that creates the pottery. See what I mean?
There's a danger in this argument. One of the things you hear is that the person has to be able to code from scratch. Now, once upon a time, when we realized that logarithms, you can change a difficult multiplication into an addition. So we had a slide rule. Now, there would have been a point where people would say, we're not hiring people who need a slide rule. Then there was a further point where people would say, we're only hiring people who can use slide rules because they can get through the mathematics quicker. And then the history repeated itself because then we had a calculator and we'd be like, well, you've got to be able to use a slide rule. We don't want those people who use calculators here. I had a very nasty experience when I was 23. And it was during the time of web-scale application development. And so it was all Java on the back end, sometimes C++, and HTML on the front end. And I was asked to normalize a database table in an interview. And it was kind of coming back to me, first level normalization and second level normalization. And I remember I got as far as taking out 2 fields. I think 3 had a primary and foreign key relationship, but I didn't get it down to third level normalization. And no the fuck studies databases, right? Back then. And I kind of said, I think you're missing the point on this. And they were like, we're not hiring anybody in a senior role who cannot normalize a database table. But at the time, 2 things were in play. First of all, every team had a decent SQL expert who would do all of that stuff for you. And we had object relation mappers that actually did all the heavy lifting on that. So really, they let me go, and I was a pretty good programmer, I reckon, needlessly. And anyway, my friend Steve Freeman said, "Oh, he's just an alpha geek. That guy. He just doesn't want you to set him in some way. He wants to somehow prove his masculinity, beat his chest in the interview." And I just get the feeling this code from scratch idea is a bit self-limited, because as Ian said earlier, you wouldn't ask somebody to understand the compiler's inputs or outputs.
Part of me is struggling with that, Jamie, because I spent so much of my career in databases, working for a company where we did front end, back end, and the middleware, or the business logic.
Would you have made me normalize a
guess-
table? Would you have done that in an interview?
I don't think we would have hired someone who couldn't see what was wrong with a database schema and correct it. I wouldn't say they have to know about first, second, third normalization, but removing redundant data was a critical part of that job, and designing schemas correctly was a critical part of that job. So
Yeah, fair enough.
I can see why someone might focus on that.
There's someone there that is even like contextual memory from that organization, right? There probably were several events, several outages maybe, or several performance activities maybe, that were drilled down to all these VB operations that need to be done. Thus, the conclusion that we should hire for that, because that fits the contextual memory that we are. It goes against to, I think, Angus's point. We need to have the right factors that we're trying to hire for and make them constant decisions. Otherwise, we are going to apply filters down the road, and we don't really want that.
But yeah, I think you have a point, Jamie, is that a lot of hiring, particularly younger hirers, are actually scared of being shown up in an interview by the interviewee. And so they like the fact that they know about third normal form and the candidate doesn't. And that kind of sort of toxic mentality that you can get is very common. I remember when I was interviewed for university, it was a very intimidating environment. And the first thing they said was, "We'd like you to be calm. We want to see you at your best." And that was great. It was like, it just calmed me down, and it allowed me to be relaxed enough.
These interviews, or these attitude of people having about coding from scratch and proving yourself, they do sound like a way to intimidate or bully somebody, or to create a stick to hit them with. You hear about interviews where they say, "We want you to write code on the whiteboard, and we want you to some fucking equation that requires long division." Well, I've forgotten how to do long division a long time ago. And I do remember when we were building all of our hiring processes at CS, we were trying to find a candidate who could flourish. We were not trying to make people feel lousy or to exclude people unnecessarily. There was no snobbery involved. We needed to find somebody's skills to match the job. And if your job, allows you to use generative AI, then why would we exclude people who either could do it from scratch or wouldn't use those tools effectively?
I think I want to quickly take it back to what you talked about with the slide rule, because I think that hits on a very specific nuance here, which is the slide rule was good because it allowed you to speed up those calculations, and it did the job. The same with the calculator, it did the job. And back to what Gus was saying about that designer being a very good engineer, was that he could produce, I guess, minimal viable, right? He could make a prototype. And I think that's very important because there are more facets to software engineering than just what you can see. And then, as Gus said, he'd have to write the backend stuff for it. And I think some of the signals we miss with AI is stuff like maintainability, right? Extensibility, writing code that other engineers can work on. And I think we'll find with a lot of AI generated code is that you're not writing the code. What ends up happening is AI works on the code, it writes code that more AI will then work on. And no human ever touches it. People don't have to read it. So the one day an engineer does have to go into the internals and pick it apart, they're like, what the fuck am I looking at? Because they've never seen it before. They don't understand the architecture. They don't know why it exists.
That's not a new problem, though.
No,
Angus.
no, it's not. But you would hope that when people
actually,
write code, you write it with
I'd
intent.
argue against that, Angus. I'd say that the AI improves the quality, the readability of code compared to what humans have produced over the last 40 years. In many cases, I think verbosity is a problem. Whereas humans like to be concise.
Readability and maintainability, I do think, are certainly different. I think code that's easy to read, that AI certainly does write, because it puts comments all over the place, isn't necessarily the most maintainable. They'll do bizarre things where they'll say have lots of nested for loops for some strange reason, or they'll do some really terse thing that it read somewhere else because it's in its training data, or it will implement the feature you wanted, but then add a bunch of things around it because it thinks that's the correct thing to do, and because you've not been specific enough with your prompting, depending on who you ask. Yeah.
I get the feeling we're honing in on some sort of general rule, but I can't quite articulate it yet. I remember web teams really struggling when, the internet became a thing. This would be about 98, 99, 2000. And one team I was helping was full of people from the publishing industry who did everything because HTML, it's a markup language. Originally, that came from publishing. If you put something before a piece of text, I don't know, like you do now in WhatsApp, an underline before an end, you'd mark up the stuff in between and it would become italic or it would become bold. HTML grew out of SGML. So I remember publishers spending weeks and weeks and weeks trying to implement if-else logic in cascading staff sheets. And I was told that they were the experts and we were just the idiot programmers. So those people and those skills and those tools were not suitable to the emerging world of web scale application development. It took us a couple of years to work that out, actually. And then all of a sudden, the desktop publishers, vanished from the workforce. Right, let's come at this from a different angle now, because there was one thing I spotted about how AI is affecting hiring. And it goes something like this. People are using AI to create their CVs, answer preliminary questions. And so the hiring manager not only has hundreds of CVs and letters to filter out, but they all look exactly the same because the generative engines give the same answers to these questions and they all sound pretty bad. What's happening there? What are we seeing in our day-to-day work? Are we seeing like Me Too CVs and Me Too application letters?
I've long given up on CVs. And this isn't an AI thing. This is a general observation. Back when I was interviewing literally hundreds of graduates, I realized after a while that looking at the CV was actually a hindrance to me interviewing them, because I would look at the CV and then kind of often prejudge them based on what I saw on the CV. And either I would be disappointed or I would be surprised and I would just be completely off kilter. Whereas if I took them at face value of meeting them and talking to them about the topics we talked about in the interview, that was the best indicator of whether I'd want to hire them. And CV just got in the way. And part of the reason for that is that if someone puts a tech skill on their CV, Kubernetes, I've seen that mean everything from I once ran a kubectl command to, I've built Kubernetes from scratch, and I know exactly how everything works under the hood, and I've even contributed to the code base. So you can't really tell much from what people write on their CVs. And what I used to do was just get them to talk through the CV. So I said, let's talk through your CV. What did you do here? What did you do there? What did you actually do? And that helped structure the conversation, but it did no more than that.
How do you filter down if there are thousands of applications for a job, but bearing in mind that presently there are more people than there are jobs? How does the hiring manager sift through 1,000 CVs when they all potentially look the same? How did they get to meet you to have that conversation?
Well, that's easy for me to answer. We don't. we use recruiters for that, external recruiters.
Right.
And I don't know exactly how they do it, but I suspect a lot of that is talking to them and using their sort of folk knowledge from the industry to filter the candidates down to the ones they think that we will approve of. I mean, Angus came through that process. I think Gus applied directly, didn't you?
Applied directly.
Right.
Yeah, after a day, a recruitment day that we had. Some CVs are abysmal, and you can quickly discount them. They're full of errors and they don't make sense and they just don't have the skills that you need. So that's an easy filter. But when you get beyond that and you look at the CV and you look at hundreds of factors unconsciously when you're reading a CV, such as, where they've worked before. If they've worked for Google or Meta or somewhere like that, they've been through some sort of process. That means that they're probably of a certain standard, which means you can take them seriously. What skills have they used? What variety of skills they've used, and so on. but you have to be open to other things. I mean, so for example, Angus was an unusual candidate in that during the pairing, he one of the things we should have mentioned earlier, during the pairing, he wrote everything from scratch without needing to Google or anything. And that was unusual, and it was notable. But also, we could see from Angus's CV that he'd worked in one place and he'd done lots of different jobs in that one place. So that was already an indicator of something. But you use all these different signals.
But it seems to me that the answer to the question, how has AI affected tech hiring? It seems to me the answer is not very much from our perspective.
I think it's a tool, like being able to Google or using autocomplete, in an IDE. The skills we're looking for are much the same, but now we don't have to worry. If you have a simple function, is it going to take you 20 minutes, 30 minutes to write that function? Well, if it's a simple function now, you just get AI to do it, and you just check it over and see that it's fine.
Exactly. But because we're all using AI on a day-to-day basis, we have no problem judging how other people use it too. So for us, it sounds like business as usual.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The skills and the process of interviewing are the same. Just there's another tool in there.
Well, I think that's the most definitive answer we could have imagined. So thank you, Ian, Gus, and Angus. Thanks for watching Container Solutions TV. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe on YouTube and follow Container Solutions on LinkedIn for cut down parts and weekly clips. If you want help with platform engineering, cloud native transformation, or you need to follow the money in order to change how you operate your cloud at scale, then visit our website using the links below and get in touch. We'll see you in the next episode.